Clark had lived on the edge of wild country for 40 years, and he knew one rule above all others. Wild horses don't approach humans. They run. They hide. They keep their distance. So when a trembling mare appeared at his fence line with her foal pressed tight against her side, looking back over her shoulder at the trees with pure terror in her eyes, Clark knew something was very, very wrong. And when she took 3 deliberate steps toward him, breaking every instinct that kept her kind alive, he understood. She wasn't running to him. She was begging. This is a story about trust in the face of death, and the moment a wild creature chose to believe in a stranger. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, because this one is unforgettable. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Clark was 68 years old and had been alone for 3 years. His wife Margaret had passed quietly one winter morning, leaving him with 200 acres of Montana ranch land, a small herd of cattle, and a silence so complete it pressed against his chest some days. He still worked the property, fixed fences, checked water lines, kept the routines they had built together over 40 years of marriage. But the purpose felt thinner now, the days longer, the house emptier. On a crisp October afternoon, Clark was repairing a section of fence along the eastern edge of his property, where his land bordered thousands of acres of untouched wilderness. He had always loved this spot, the way the mountains rose in the distance, the way the wind carried the scent of pine and wild grass, the way it reminded him that some things still existed beyond human reach. He was tightening wire when he heard it. Hoofbeats, fast and uneven, coming from the tree line. Clark straightened and turned. What he saw made him freeze. A wild mare burst from the forest, her coat dark with sweat, her sides heaving. She was a Mustang, lean and powerful, the kind of horse that had never known a halter or a kind hand. And pressed against her flank, struggling to keep pace, was a foal. Small, maybe 3 months old, its legs shaky with exhaustion. The mare stopped 50 yards from Clark's fence. Her head whipped around, looking back at the trees. Her nostrils flared, her ears pinned flat. And then Clark saw why. A shadow moved at the edge of the forest. Low, deliberate, patient. A mountain lion. Clark's breath caught. He had seen them before, glimpses, mostly tracks in the snow, the occasional distant shape moving through the rocks. But never this close, never this bold. The mare saw it too. She spun, placing herself between the predator and her foal, her body rigid with fear. The foal pressed tighter against her, trembling. For a long moment, nothing moved. The mare, the lion, Clark, all frozen in a deadly calculation. And then the mare did something Clark had never seen in 40 years of living on the edge of wild country. She turned toward him, not away, toward. She took 1 step forward, then another, then a third. Her eyes locked on Clark's, wide and desperate, her body still angled protectively over her foal. She was asking. Clark understood immediately. This wild creature, whose entire existence had been built on avoiding humans, had just made a choice. The mountain lion was certain death. The man was a gamble, and she was betting her foal's life that he would help. Clark didn't hesitate. He vaulted the fence and placed himself directly between the mare and the trees. The mountain lion emerged fully from the shadows. It was massive, a male, easily 150 pounds. Its yellow eyes locked on the foal with the cold focus of a predator that had already decided this was prey. Clark spread his arms wide, making himself as large as possible. He shouted, a deep, guttural sound that echoed across the clearing. The lion paused. Its tail flicked, but it didn't retreat. Behind him, Clark heard the mare shift. She didn't run. She stayed, trusting him, waiting. The lion took a step forward. Clark grabbed a loose fence post from the pile beside him and slammed it against the ground. The crack echoed like a gunshot. The lion flinched but held its ground. They were locked in a standoff. Clark's heart pounded. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He couldn't turn his back, couldn't reach for his phone, couldn't leave the mare and foal unprotected. Quick question. If a wild animal broke every instinct to ask you for help, would you risk your life for it? Let me know in the comments. Now back to the story. The lion circled slowly to the left, testing the edges, looking for an opening. Clark moved with it, keeping himself between predator and prey. Sweat dripped down his back despite the cool air. Then, faintly, Clark heard the sound of an engine. A truck, coming up the access road to his property. It was Gary, his neighbor, a man who owned the adjacent ranch and occasionally stopped by to check on Clark since Margaret had passed. The truck came into view. Gary saw the scene immediately. The lion, the horses, Clark standing in the middle with a fence post raised like a weapon. Gary didn't ask questions. He grabbed an air horn from his truck bed, the kind used to scare off bears, and sprinted toward the fence line. The blast was deafening. The mountain lion's head snapped toward the sound. Its ears flattened. For a moment, it looked like it might charge anyway. But Gary fired the horn again, and this time the lion turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Clark stood there, chest heaving, the fence post still gripped in his hands. Behind him, the mare hadn't moved. She was still there, her foal tucked against her, watching him with eyes that held something Clark couldn't quite name. Gary jogged over, breathing hard. He looked at Clark, then at the mare, then back at Clark. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly he spoke. "Did that wild horse just ask you for help?" Clark nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think she did." Gary shook his head in disbelief. 40 years out here. Never seen anything like that. The two men stood in silence, watching the mare. She was still tense, still watchful, but the immediate terror had faded from her eyes. The foal was nursing now, its small tail flicking with relief. Slowly, carefully, Clark took a step back, then another, giving her space, letting her decide what happened next. The mare watched him. She didn't run. She stood there, breathing slowly, her gaze steady. Then she lowered her head, just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been nothing. But Clark recognized it for what it was. Acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. Gary climbed back into his truck, promising to check the tree line and make sure the lion had moved on. Clark stayed at the fence, watching the mare and her foal until the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber. Only then did the mare turn and walk slowly back toward the wilderness, her foal beside her. But she didn't go far. She stopped at the edge of the trees, looked back once, and then disappeared into the shadows. Clark stood there long after they were gone, the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones. Over the following days, something extraordinary began to happen. The mare returned. Not every day, not at the same time, but regularly. She would appear at the edge of Clark's property, grazing in the open meadow where she could see the house. The foal stayed close, growing stronger, more confident. Clark never approached them, never tried to touch them or tame them. He understood that wasn't what this was about. She was wild. She would stay wild, but she had chosen to stay near him, and that choice meant something. Sometimes Clark would sit on his porch in the evenings, a cup of coffee in his hands, and watch her graze. She would lift her head occasionally, glance toward him, then go back to eating. It was a quiet companionship, an understanding between two creatures who had both survived something. Weeks turned into months. Winter came. Clark noticed the mare had thickened her coat, and the foal had grown tall and strong. They moved through the snow with ease, wild and free, but always returning to the edges of his land. One morning, Clark walked out to the fence line and found hoof prints in the fresh snow. The mare had come closer than usual during the night, right up to the fence, and beside her prints were smaller ones. The foal. Clark stood there, looking at the tracks, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The ranch didn't feel so empty. Margaret had always said that the land provided, that if you paid attention, it would give you what you needed, even if it wasn't what you expected. Clark hadn't expected a wild horse, hadn't expected the responsibility that came with being chosen. But standing there in the snow, watching the sun rise over the mountains, he understood what Margaret had meant. The mare hadn't just asked for help that day. She had given Clark something too, a reason to keep showing up. A reminder that trust, even from the wildest of creatures, was earned through action, not words. And in a life that had felt finished, that was enough to keep going. The mare and her foal still visit. Clark still sits on his porch. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the sky is clear, the mare will stand at the fence line and look toward the house. She remembers the day he chose to help. And Clark remembers the day she chose to trust. Two wild hearts, both marked by loss, both still beating. Clark didn't know if the mare would survive when she appeared at his fence that day. He just knew he couldn't walk away. And in saving her, she gave him something he didn't know he needed. A reason to believe that even the wildest, most broken things can still choose connection. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to see it. Hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this one.